I hear you bringing one to church now, huh?
All right. We have, if you will go to week 16 in your book, you'll see that we have a lot of material to cover. So I'm going to give very little input. There's just a couple of things. If you look at a map, Google this sometime, a map of the Roman Empire roads, you'll see that Paul stays along those roads, and the cities where he established churches often were at the crossroads of roads going north and south and roads going east and west. And so, in some sense, maybe the time that Jesus Christ came to earth, that God came to us through Jesus Christ, was intended at this time when so many roads had been built by the Romans, and it was very easy to get the word out using those roads. The other thing is that we have in our book, and I think maybe John had given this to us with the dates, and we put ours right in the beginning, but it's colored on one side, on the other side it's the dates of the books in chronological order. And the books we're covering today are Galatians, which was written before Mark and Matthew, and then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, all written in the same period of time that Mark and Matthew was written. And all of these are written by Paul, contemporary to the writing of Mark and Matthew. And makes you wonder whether when Paul had returned to Jerusalem and met with the Council of Jerusalem, which is made up of the apostles who were with Christ, if maybe he had suggested to them, I'm teaching them about Christ and about his place in God's plan that we know about from the Old Testament scriptures, which were the scriptures to them at the time. And maybe he encouraged them to say, we've got to get it down in writing what you saw and what you heard from Christ. And so you need to look at those dates there. I think it's significant to know that Paul is writing at the same time or earlier than what Mark and Matthew did, and also before Luke, and also long before John in his 70s wrote his gospel. So let's get started. Excuse my voice, and I went hard partying with the Paynes and Lewis's last night and woke up with Barry White. So, yeah, but this crowd understands. So, all right. Paul wrote this letter. This is Romans. Paul wrote this letter to the church in Rome, from the city of Corinth near the end of the third missionary journey. For the occasion, Paul had spent a considerable amount of time preaching the gospel in many of the strategic centers of population in the known Mediterranean world. Rome was the capital, and if the gospel could be planted there in the Roman Empire, it would undoubtedly have far-reaching effects. Paul had not yet been to Rome. His purpose, Paul clearly intended this epistle to prepare the church in Rome for his visit. The epistle contains Paul's most detailed description and explanation of the gospel. Paul wanted to make sure the church in Rome had a complete and full understanding of the gospel. He didn't start this church, so perhaps he wasn't confident in their understanding of the major tenets of faith. Paul was already feeling the pressure of persecution. For example, in Corinth, which is in Acts 20.3. Now, if you go to look at that, you need to make a change there. It's not Corinth, it's Ephesus. And it's Acts 19 through 7. and 20 continues there with the pressure he was receiving in Ephesus. And he might not have been sure of what he would live to get the chance to preach the gospel west of Greece. Romans is by far the greatest and most comprehensive of Paul's works, laying out the truths of salvation in an orderly manner. Chapters 1 through 8, in short, teach that all people are sinners. Salvation comes from faith through God's grace, and that salvation leads to a change in lifestyle. Chapters 9 through 11 deal with the relationship between salvation and the Jews. And chapters 12 through 16 provide some practical guidelines for living the Christian life. Now, I went through that fast. So that's chapters 1 through 8 is about sinners. Chapters 9 through 11 is about salvation. Chapters 12 through 16 is about living the Christian life. Lord, hand me my cup. All right. So, 1 Corinthians. Paul wrote this epistle sometime after his first visit to Corinth. While he was in the city of Ephesus on his third missionary trip. So this is his first visit to Corinth. And then he wrote his letter. The occasion had just received a report from Chloe's household. A letter from the church itself which contained some specific questions. 1 Corinthians 1:11 and 7:1. The purpose, Paul wrote this first letter to correct some serious doctrinal and moral sins, things that were dividing the church. So that he wrote to correct some serious doctrinal and moral sins. 1 Corinthians is an excellent practical document teaching about the daily living of individual Christians, corporate worship, and other key issues. 2 Corinthians, Paul wrote this epistle to the church of Corinth when he was in Philippi, which is in Macedonia. Several events happened between 1st and 2nd Corinthians that will be helpful to highlight. In the spring of 55 AD, 1 Corinthians was written, and the church responded well and made changes. In the summer and fall of 55 AD, conditions turned bad, and Paul had to make a painful visit. In the spring of 56 AD, Paul wrote a severe letter. And that letter is lost. It's referred to, but it's lost. And it's referred to in 2nd chapter, 3 through 9, and 7 through 8, and the 12th verses. In the summer of 56 AD, Titus arrived in Macedonia to update Paul on conditions in the Corinthian church. Now, I'm going to pause there for a moment. When you look at the commentaries, there is some sense that 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter because he refers to a letter he had written earlier to the church. There are many scholars who say that first letter he refers to, he wrote to specific individuals rather than to the whole church. And then this lost letter that's between 1st and 2nd Corinthians is referred to in 2nd Corinthians, and that one's lost as well, but there are some scholars who say that too was written to individuals to find out what problems had occurred, and that's why he wrote the second Corinthians. On the occasions with regard to 2 Corinthians, Titus had returned to Paul and reported that the Corinthians responded well to the severe letter. Sometime after Titus' report, disturbing news about the church in Corinth arrived. So the purpose of 2 Corinthians was to express delight and relief at the Corinthians' positive response to the severe letter, to remind the church to complete their collection of relief money to help the Christians in Jerusalem. So to remind the church about the need in Jerusalem, and to prepare them for his upcoming visit by having them engage in self-examination. So to prepare them for his upcoming visit. Then Paul wrote Galatians. Paul wrote this to, well, I shouldn't say that without looking at this list. Because what you have to remember is the letters of Paul are organized longest letter to shortest letter, not by chronology. So this list of chronology is in a different order than what you have it in your New Testament. Paul wrote this to the churches of Galatia from the city of Antioch. There is very little agreement as to who the Galatians actually were. This is debated widely among scholars. The term Galatia could refer to two different things: an ethnic group or a province created by the Romans. Paul visited both, so either could be possible. The northern theory is that the original territory held by the ethnic group. The southern theory is that the Romans created a province which was further south. Okay, I can't resist. I like geography. So, here is Asia Minor. This is what we now call Turkey. And here is our Bosporus Strait and our Black Sea. This is, you're going to wonder what this is.
We already do.
All right, so this is the Aegean Sea, and which is misspelled.
It's the board.
All right, yes, it's the board. All right. Right. So, so you have here, we'll get to it. This is Ephesus. And this is Colossae. And then you have this area here. This is Galatia. And that's the territory that Rome had made, but the ethnic group of Galatians is this area here. So your northern theory is that Paul was writing to the Galatians who were ethnically Galatian. The southern theory is that he was writing to the province of Galatia, which was created by the Romans and included more than the Galatians. All right, and I put this up here so that you would know when we get to it. All right, so the occasion of Galatians is that Christianity was just beginning to take root in the Gentile world because the earliest church members were Jewish. An important problem arose. Would the Gentiles have to take on Jewish culture and religious practices, such as circumcision? So would they have to take on those religious practices of Judaism? The debate held some serious consequences for Christian unity, because the answer would turn out to be the key on the theology of salvation. The purpose, Paul answered this debate with a very loud no. Salvation is by faith in Christ. Paul begins his argument by laying down his credentials as an apostle called by God, preaching the one true gospel. Even the Jewish apostles, Peter and James, extended to Paul the right hand of fellowship. He had the authority to teach the true gospel. Paul teaches that if a person follows the Mosaic law, it will lead to spiritual death. Salvation is only through God's grace. Although the cornerstone of Christianity is by faith, Paul explains the meaning of Christian freedom. So to follow the law would be spiritual death. Accepting the grace, having faith, is Christian freedom. You, my brothers, were called to be free, it says in Galatians 5:13. But do not use your freedom to indulge in sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. Then the book of Ephesians, Paul wrote this epistle to the church of Ephesus while he was imprisoned in Rome. The occasion, Paul wrote, although Paul was in prison, it was more like house arrest, which allowed him to receive visitors. Paul had received a report from Epaphras concerning several congregations. One of Paul's representatives, Tychicus, that's my guess, a native of Ephesus, was about to leave Rome for Ephesus. Paul sent with him 3 letters, Colossians, Philemon, and Ephesians. Paul started the church in Ephesus on the way home from his second missionary journey. He only stayed for a brief period of time. However, on his third missionary journey, he stayed in Ephesus for more than 3 years. Ephesus was the hub of a huge province. Its rim contained 236 independent communities. Although Paul spent his time in Ephesus, the gospel soon spread to the surrounding communities. Now, little history. This is the Ionian coast. The Ionian coast. The Athenians were a seafaring people, and they had colonized islands in the south of the Aegean Sea and the Ionian coast. If you remember the Persian Wars, which I'm sure you don't, the Persian Wars started here in these Greek colonies. And these Greek colonies revolted against the Persians, and the Persians started shutting down the revolt, and the Athenians came to the rescue. And that made the Persians really mad. But ultimately, what had happened is that all of these Greek city-states and these colonies were able to repel the western advance of the Persian Empire. And then from then on, the Greek influence on this coast was very strong. And because of the Athenians' trade, all of these colonies became trade ports for the interior of the Asia Minor. So when you get to this period of time of the Roman Empire, these are very important ports for trade, but with trade goes ideas. All right. The purpose of Ephesians is this letter was especially intended for general circulation and does not deal with particular church issues. Paul uses this letter to explain the fellowship of Christians are to have within the church. Although most of the major Pauline themes are reflected in the epistle, its main theme is in the unity of believers which comes through Christ. This unity includes not only the church, but will also include all creation at the end of time. All right. All right, these become important here. Paul wrote this epistle of Philippians to the church at Philippi while he was imprisoned in Rome. The Philippians seem to be separate from the other prison epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, because it was carried by a different messenger. The occasion, while in prison, the Philippian church sent a messenger, Epaphroditus, to Paul with a gift. Epaphroditus was also sent to minister to Paul's needs, and doubtless he brought news of the church's progress. During the course of his ministry, Epaphroditus became gravely ill and almost died. When he got better, he went home, and Paul sent this epistle to him. Rejoice in the Lord always, I say again, and rejoice. Philippians 4:4, which is the purpose of the letter. All of the letters Paul wrote to the churches, Philippians stands out as the most personal letter. Paul had no sharp words of rebuke, only encouragement. This epistle screams joy to the reader, although Paul is in chains and some are preaching the gospel with bad motives. He is still filled with joy. He wants the Philippians to also be filled with joy no matter what. Colossians. Paul wrote this letter to the church of Colossae while he was imprisoned in Rome. There is no record in Acts or otherwise of the establishment of this church, although it was 100 miles from Ephesus, so it's 100 miles east of Ephesus. Colossae was probably evangelized during Paul's extended stay in Ephesus. Now, occasion. As mentioned above, under Ephesus occasion, the arrival of Epaphras to Rome brought Paul news about many churches. Apparently, Colossae had some heretical teachers, although difficult to ascertain with certainty, and the Colossian heresy consisted of three elements. Colossian heresy includes the Jewish element, legalism, observance of holy days; a pagan element, early Gnosticism, the belief that all physical things were evil, salvation came through knowledge, worship, and many gods; and Christian element, really more a mask than a true element. This heresy did not deny Christ, but it dethroned him. Paul wrote Colossians to express his interest in the church, to warn them against returning to their old ways, and to refute the so-called Colossian heresy. Now turn back to the other page. I need to make some corrections. All right, so going back to Philippians, the name of Epaphroditus, as difficult as that may be to say, was a common name, common Greek name, and a common shortening of that name is Epaphras, which is mentioned down below under Colossians. It's like Michael and Mike, okay? But these are not the same two people. I mean, these two people are not the same person. If you read more carefully in the scripture, Epaphroditus is from Philippi, and he got sick, and he was anxious to go home to assure his people he had recovered. Go home to Philippi. Epaphras is credited with being one of the main leaders or the starter of his home church in Colossae. You can't have a home in Colossae and a home in Philippi. Well, there are people here in America that do that, but not during this period of time. All right? These are two different people. And so this down here under occasion of Colossians, these are two different people. And if you want the scriptures for Colossia, you look at Colossians 1:7 and Colossians 4:12, and then you can also look at Acts 19:10. And it may be that Epaphras had learned from Ephesus about Paul and had become a Christian under Paul when Paul was in Ephesus for those 3 years. And then he took that gospel back home to Colossae and started the church. With regard to Epaphroditus, if you will look in Philippians 2:25 and Philippians 4:18, also you look at 2:26 through 30, you'll see that he is anxious to go home to Philippi. So I just wanted to clarify that. Stuck out in my head. 1 Thessalonians. Paul wrote this epistle to the church in Thessalonica from the city of Corinth. The occasion, Timothy returned from Thessalonica to Corinth with a report about their faith and love. Timothy's report included how well the church was standing in spite of persecution, that there were some people in the church trying to undermine Paul's authority, reputation, and sincerity, and that the church was confused about what happened to the dead, and that some areas of their moral life needed improvement. The purpose, in response to Timothy's report, Paul sought to express thanks to God for the church's health, to argue against those who sought to undermine his work. So he suggests some specific ways the church could live better lives. 2 Thessalonians, Paul wrote this epistle shortly after his first letter to the church in Thessalonica. Paul was still in Corinth and had received news that the church's further progress. The occasion, apparently the persecution became much worse for the church. The persecution was mixed with false teaching, and this led to the belief that the end times were upon the church. Since many believed the return of Christ was very near, people had begun to quit their jobs. In response to the situation or the occasion in Thessalonica, Paul sought to encourage the church to hang on through their persecutions, to correct their bad theology concerning the return of Christ, and to exhort the church to keep away from people who quit their jobs. We're not going anywhere with that one.
Politically incorrect.
Yes. So, wow, I expected days to get through that. Did anybody miss anything? All right, good. Any questions, thoughts, profundities you would like to add?
That one
Okay.
about lost letter.
Yeah.
That means there was one of Paul's letters that they thought was lost, and it's
Yeah, he refers to having written to them before. And so when he writes 1 Corinthians, he's writing about whether they had responded to what he had said earlier, or whether they had responded and he was glad for it. And really that was what 1 Corinthians about. The debate among the scholars, when they're doing form criticism, when they're looking at what he's saying and they're saying, oh, hey, he's mentioning another letter there, and we don't have that letter. And archaeologists have been looking for those two letters, if there are four letters. There are some who believe that some of that first letter is actually included in 2 Corinthians, that it's, I want to say, chapter 6 and 7 in 2 Corinthians. It goes right along, and all of a sudden, chapter 6 and 7 seem to be an interruption to his flow of thought. But if you've read enough of Paul's letters, you realize he interrupts himself all the time. and goes off on a tangent and then comes back to the original theme. I don't know anybody like that. So that's the clue, is that maybe in 2 Corinthians, that chapter 6 and 7 really is that first letter that Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians. The fourth letter is referred to in 2 Corinthians, and it's a little foggier about whether any part of that is included in 2 Corinthians. It's really doubtful. So there are letters out there that still could be found in our lifetime, written by Paul, that gives us a fuller picture of what happened in Corinthians. And these letters that we have from Paul are letters to churches. Only a couple of them are written to individuals like Timothy. He's a prolific writer. How many personal letters out there have been lost, or sitting buried someplace in a jar, or something? Some of these letters, and during the persecutions, some of these letters have been found in churches that were held in caves in the side of mountains, and they were found in those caves, sitting on a shelf that was carved out in the side of the wall of where they were worshiping inside the caves. And what other caves might be in Turkey that have not been discovered? I mean, you got to remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were until 1967.
Yeah.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, that confirms a lot of what we have in the Old Testament. With they were scrolls that they written by the Essenes and kept in jars. And some shepherd boy throws a rock in the cave to see if he can hit the cave, and he hears something break. And that's how we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. So who knows what's there? All right, just this week, if you saw it in the news, there were some stone tools found that had on them, or not tools, stone balls that had on them the marks of the first temple that was built in Jerusalem. And these stones, you would pay your shekel for your tithe, and you would be given the stone, and then you go into the temple and you place your stone in there. And it was part of the temple worship. They found some of those stones from that first temple, and they had never found them before. But the way they knew that it was from the first temple before it was rebuilt was because of the way the script was written or carved on that little stone, and this stone is no bigger than a marble, was the same script of the same period. That just like English writing has changed over time, the Hebrew changed over time, and it's a script from the old Hebrew from when the temple was originally built. And so they're still finding things in Israel that go back and confirm things that in Scripture, and it's exciting.
The news also this week apparently has found Pontius Pilate's signet ring.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see that.
About 50 years ago, I read that this morning. The ring was found, but they've just now confirmed that they believe that it was
Where it was from. Yeah, yeah. So, the archaeologists and scholars, they don't rush to the media. They want to check all their facts and make sure, but it's really exciting to see our faith in the Scriptures confirmed over and over and over by archaeologists. And God had a plan, and this just helps confirm it. We don't need the confirmation because we see God in our lives. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. You're up.
Did the prayer list get around anywhere?